Hi, I'm Patrick Higgins. We approach 2023 with a slowing global economy, war in Europe, an accelerating climate emergency, and changing attitudes and expectations of customers, employees, and other stakeholders. Rarely have businesses faced a more uncertain future. So over the next 4 episodes, we'll be covering everything from geopolitics and globalization to organizational transformation, leadership, culture, purpose, and what businesses and their leaders have to do to create sustainable value. I hope you enjoy the ride. Welcome everybody. Welcome Kate.
Thank you very much.
You promised a real fireside.
And I delivered.
And here is the real fireside.
It's pretty good, isn't it? At least it's not going because it would just be way too hot, but you know.
I know. It would have been lovely, but it's a shame. English weather.
Yeah,
can't have
well,
everything. So again, look, thank you for hosting this. And we said we were going to do 4 episodes, and today we're going to talk about sustainable transformation. So global businesses are facing a lot of significant headwinds at the moment. And you work with a huge range of organizations and leaders. How do you contextualize what's happening at the moment, and what does it mean for those companies in the future?
I think it's difficult to overestimate just what significant changes are happening for business per se right now, because really the basis on which business has been, undertaken for for centuries is changing, and you can boil it all down to a deceptively simple question, which is how are we going to create value in the future? And the interesting thing is that companies up until now have really only had one responsibility, and that is to create profit. That's what companies were designed for. If you go all the way back to the Renaissance, the original commenda and limited liability partnerships, the corporate law, all these kind of things, which you know all about, all of these things came from a need to limit liability and create profit. That's really what the structures are about. And we are now in this absolutely fascinating period where for the first time, people are saying value is not just profit. Because we talk about value, right? But what we really mean is profit. Let's be clear about this. We all know that. Up until now, value has meant how much profit you can create. But now we're talking about value in a very nuanced way. And in fact, what we're really saying is that creating profit is not value enough. We're actually saying, no, now, even if you create that profit, if it's at the expense of other things, or if it creates other externalities, then that weighs against you. The profit is not enough on its own. So that's a very big, broad brush statement. But I think as we talk more, if you take that as sort of the box in which we're playing, I think it starts to make sense of a lot of the trends and the other things that are happening. If at the heart of it you say, we have to start taking a different attitude to our responsibility and what we actually mean by value, then that's a fairly good place to start. And
so presumably that value means focusing not just on bottom line, but also on your wider stakeholders and the impact you have there, right? So this notion of creating shared value.
Yep.
And the notion of creating shared value is 10 or 11 years old when Porter and Kramer first hypothesized about it, but it's only really coming to prominence now. There are still a lot of companies that don't create shared value. They don't understand this notion. So presumably a lot of companies have got to go on this digital transformation journey or a transformation journey of some kind, right? So we're used to hearing about digital transformation and digital disruption, but you think we have to go beyond that now. And in particular, you talk about sustainable transformation that needs to take place in business. So what for you, what does that actually look like?
I think that there's a couple of really important points there that if we track that back on value, we talk about value, we talk about shared value, that that is a transformation. You have to transform a business in order to focus on broader types of value. Now, the transformation, as you say, that everybody's been looking at for the last 8-10 years actually is this digital transformation. And it's really fascinating that for a long time we had, all the, the McKinseys, etc., telling us, digital transformation is what we need, digital transformation is what we need. And just sort of around 2019, 2020, just before the pandemic really hit, that kind of changed. And suddenly it became, well, digital transformation hasn't worked, so maybe we need to look at things in a slightly different way. And that was because digital transformation failed to address a lot of the cultural issues. So what we tried to do was say, if we introduce technology, then it'll solve these problems that are actually coming from, where the business is focused, how, whether it has it's legitimate in the eyes of its stakeholders and its employees. And you can't bring in technology that changes that. Technology can enable an advantage, but it's never the advantage in and of itself, because anybody can introduce a technology. The really difficult thing to do is to change the business. And so when we talk about sustainable transformation is much, much broader, but digital is still part of it, right? That I would say that there are 4 connected competencies around sustainable transformation. One of them is data and digital. One of them is enterprise and value chain agility. Another one is ESG, and then finally purpose-led business. So those I identify as the 4 connected competencies that you need in order to achieve a sustainable transformation.
Interesting that you talk about ESG. So ESG is the new buzzword in a lot of companies. There's various different reporting standards around the world, various different requirements. A lot of people see it as an extension of CSR, which I think was, for a lot of people, was just a papering over and a paper exercise, greenwashing, whatever else you want to call it. So what don't we get about ESG at the moment, and what are we getting wrong?
ESG, right, is a window to the future. And a lot of, certainly investors, are considering ESG as a window to the future, because it comes back to this, how am I going to create value in the future? Because the basis on which companies create value are changing, and ESG is a really big driver for that. So if you can understand a company's ESG position, then that gives you your window to the future and what the future performance of that business is likely to be, which is why investors are so interested. Yes, there's an element of, you need certain, green stuff in your portfolio, but more than that, and this is where companies that really understand ESG have worked out that, as you say, it started with sort of CSR and something that you siloed off, with HR or some cost center that we use a tick box exercise, and we create this this report now and again. But what people began to realize initially, probably in sort of finance and enterprise risk, was that this CSR, ESG stuff, well, this is interesting because this is actually enterprise risk. This is showing you material risks for the future. So it's like, okay, this becomes interesting. And then there's this final sort of epiphany where senior leaders went, well, if this is showing us dynamic, risks, enterprise risk, maybe it could also be showing us where value creation could take place in the future.
Yeah. And it's interesting because on that point, when we talked about creating shared value, the notion of creating shared value, we're talking about ESG, and one of the ways you embed this notion of creating shared value is through a company's purpose. So there must be value at the end of this if you embed ESG and the approach to shared value correctly through a company's purpose, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing about purpose is that, and we'll probably come on to talk a bit more about this, but in the same way that it's not enough now just to create profit, it's also not enough to be neutral. Because one of the other things that businesses have been allowed to do is be neutral. And we are not seeing that anymore. Suddenly businesses, and I mean, we've just had, the World Cup, Football World Cup, there's been a lot of controversy around that. It's a great example of where brands and companies are finally being expected to take a stand on things. And that's very uncomfortable. And this is where, ESG and purpose becomes really important. Because if you have to take a decision as a leadership about whether you make an investment or you do something, and what you're looking at is the bottom line. Are we going to make a return on that? Are we going to make a return on our investment? That's pretty simple, right? We know how to do that. We've all done MBAs, whatever. We can understand that. When you have to make a decision about whether you speak out on an issue or whether you don't do business somewhere or whether you terminate a relationship with an influencer or all these kind of things, how do you make that decision, right? And that's where purpose comes in. Because if you have an established North Star purpose for your organization, those decisions suddenly have a context, they have a framework. They have something to measure against. Because then you can legitimately say, our stated purpose is X, Y, and Z. And actually, this course of action is not aligned with the purpose of our business. And then, and this is where it gets really tricky, even if you have a conflict then between this aligns with our purpose, but it doesn't necessarily align with our profitability. I'm not saying that solves the problem for you, but it actually gives you a framework in which to make those decisions. Is our purpose, is this impact on our stated purpose significant enough that we can forego a level of profit potentially to not pursue this opportunity? Because those increasingly are the decisions that senior leaderships are going to have to make. And there is no context. Without a stated purpose, how do you make those decisions, right?
And you're talking there about decision making, and that would flow across into investment decisions that external people are making as to whether or not they invest in your company. So your stated ESG purpose, you need to be careful about what you say publicly. And we've seen this in the US already, right? Where people are making statements that the regulators now are taking into account. Absolutely.
I mean, the SEC has fined more than one company. I think Vale certainly has been fined, and I believe that there's a fine being levied elsewhere as well. And this is because they made what the SEC deemed to be misleading ESG statements. And this is the thing, this is material. And I think this is the bit that people miss about ESG. They're still stuck in this mindset that it's about, gender equality but it's not. This is actual material statements that you are making and if investors are investing on the basis of your ESG statements, you're talking about environmental, social and governance. These are really, really big, important things. It's not enough to say, oh, well, here's an ESG report, whatever, we'll sign it off. No, and I think what the SEC has demonstrated here is that, in the same way that you make financial statements, you make ESG statements that people are relying on. And if they are not factually correct, then you are going to be taken to task and you're going to be fined. And it should be a wake-up call, really, for a lot of boards.
The extension of that is that this kind of transformation should not be and doesn't need to be a zero-sum game, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sustainable transformation, we're used to talking about, competitiveness in business and, the winner takes all and zero-sum game. I like to talk about the hero-sum game, which may sound a bit cheesy, but I think it's important because what heroes understand is that sometimes you have to give up a little for everybody to win. And that speaks to ecosystem thinking because for example, some of the harder to abate industries, you look at them and they're talking about transportation. How do we decarbonise transportation? Well, the point is that you can't expect transportation to decarbonise all by itself because it's part of a value chain. It's part of value chains and supply chains. So when you look at specifically decarbonisation, this is very relevant because you can't do that on your own. You have to have other people involved in that, an ecosystem involved in that to make it work. So sustainable transformation is a team sport. It's not something that any company can win at. And this is a really big mindset shift for leaders because that's not what we've been trained to do as leaders. We've been trained to compete and to win. And what we're now saying is, no, the best leaders are going to be those that convene and catalyze action and create value. So the way they do that is creating value in a completely different way than we've ever had to before, because that will enable everybody then to win. So sustainable transformation is not something that you can win at as a company. It's a team sport. And that's why it's so fascinating.
Kate, that brings us to the end of our first Fireside Chat. So thank you so much for having me here. I look forward to coming back for episode 2.
Thank you.
Thank you.